When we think about sexually transmitted infections, or STIs, it's easy to picture a problem that science has already solved. But the truth is, we're in this constant arms race against pathogens that are always evolving. So how are we keeping up? Let's dive into the evolving threat of STIs and see how our own strategies are being forced to adapt.
To really get a sense of the scale of this challenge, just look at this number. According to the World Health Organization, 500 million people, that's 500 million, are living with a genital herpes infection. This isn't some niche problem. It's a global health reality that impacts hundreds of millions of lives.
And this is really the heart of it all. The bacteria and viruses that cause STIs, they are not standing still. They are constantly developing new ways to dodge our immune systems and resist our treatments. And that means our own strategies, for testing, for treatment, for prevention, have to be just as dynamic to keep pace.
Okay, so let's start with what's happening right now. Over the past decade, public health officials have been tracking a really substantial and frankly pretty worrying surge in the most common bacterial STIs, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. This isn't some historical problem. It's a modern public health challenge that's unfolding as we speak.
To understand why this is happening, we need to zoom in and look at the pathogens themselves. They've developed some incredibly clever molecular strategies to survive and thrive inside our bodies, which makes them so much harder to fight. And that's the key question, isn't it? These aren't new diseases. We've known about them for centuries. So what's changed? Well, the answer lies in their amazing ability to pull off a kind of biological disappearing act, a concept scientists call immune escape. Basically, immune escape is the master toolkit a pathogen uses to go completely unnoticed by our body's defenses. By either hiding from or actively shutting down our immune response, these organisms can set up shop for the long haul, causing chronic infections before we even realize they're there.
And what's so fascinating here is that different pathogens use totally different strategies. Think of syphilis as the ultimate stealth operator. It has very few proteins on its outer surface for our immune system to even see, and it's constantly changing those surface antigens, kind of like a spy swapping disguises. Gonorrhea, on the other hand, is more of a brute force superbug. It directly attacks our immune cells, and maybe most concerning of all, it's become an expert at resisting the antibiotics we throw it at.
So when you're facing these evolving threats, where do you even start? Well, our first line of defense has got to be better detection. Finding infections earlier and more accurately is how we break that chain of transmission. And it all begins with smarter testing.
Now, a huge part of smarter testing is understanding two really important timelines that people often get confused. The incubation period, that's when you might start to feel sick. But the window period, that's the time it takes before a test can actually find the infection. Confusing the two is a really common mistake. If you test too early, inside that window period, you can get a false negative, even if you are in fact infected.
And you can see from these timelines why timing is just everything. A test for gonorrhea can be accurate after only about 7 days, but for chlamydia, you've got to wait 14. For syphilis and HIV, that window is even longer. We're talking up to 90 days for syphilis and 45 days for HIV. So knowing these specific windows is absolutely critical to getting an accurate picture of your health.
Beyond just timing, public health experts are pushing for two major shifts in strategy. The first is extragenital testing. We now know that infections in the throat and rectum are super common and almost always asymptomatic, which means they act as these hidden reservoirs for transmission. The second is a really powerful policy change called opt-out screening, which makes testing the default for at-risk populations.
And this is so important because it tackles one of the biggest barriers, stigma. By making STI screening just a routine part of a visit, instead of something a patient has to awkwardly ask for, it normalizes the whole process. And the research shows that this approach doesn't just find more infections, it's also cost-effective and helps break down that social wall that stops people from getting the care they need. Okay, so finding the infections is only half the battle, right? We also have to make sure our treatments are actually still effective against these evolving bugs. And that means we have to constantly be updating our guidelines based on the latest science. This is just a perfect example of science in action. For years, the standard treatment for chlamydia was this convenient single dose of a drug called azithromycin. But then, a major study revealed a huge problem. It was only curing rectal chlamydia about 74% of the time. The same study showed that a 7-day course of a different antibiotic, doxycycline, had 100% cure rate. That evidence directly led to a change in the playbook. And we saw a very similar evidence-based shift for gonorrhea.
Faced with this growing threat of antibiotic resistance, the CDC updated its recommendation, doubling the standard dose of the frontline antibiotic, ceftriaxone, from 250 to 500 milligrams.
So why the higher dose? Well, scientists figured out that it's just much harder for the antibiotic to reach effective levels in the tissue of the throat, or the pharynx. And since these throat infections are often missed and they're harder to cure, the stronger dose makes sure we're hitting the bacteria hard enough to knock it out, wherever it might be hiding.
Finally, let's look ahead. Because while treatment is crucial, the ultimate goal is, of course, prevention. And there are some incredibly exciting developments on the horizon that could fundamentally change how we approach STIs.
We are entering a whole new era of prevention. First, you've got something called doxypep, which is taking an antibiotic after a potential exposure. Landmark trials show it can slash the risk of getting chlamydia and syphilis by 2/3. Second, it turns out an existing meningitis vaccine seems to offer some protection against gonorrhea, which has totally jump-started research for a targeted vaccine. And finally, using that same mRNA tech from the COVID vaccines, scientists are now testing a therapeutic vaccine to prevent recurrent herpes outbreaks.
And this all brings us to a final and maybe the most critical question. The science is moving at an incredible pace, giving us all these amazing new tools. But those tools are only effective if people can actually access them without fear or shame. It really makes you wonder, as we continue this fight, if our greatest obstacle isn't the complex biology of these pathogens, but the social stigma that keeps us from confronting them openly.